this video, I want to discuss structure representation strategy. The files, you can get to the files that I use in this video in a link in the description. I want to mention the goal here is to be effective, to have an effective exchange of information. I'm not going to go over this, but look for the other videos that explain this in more detail. And specifically, keep in mind that if you have to make sure that things work based on testing, and otherwise they're just not going to work. So structure representation strategy. So a standard setter or regulator or somebody that wants to create a reporting scheme specifies what that reporting scheme is. Entities create reports per that specification, and regulators, analysts, data aggregators, and others that consume information do so leveraging that specification to read information from the reports. Okay, so this is not three different silos. This is one supply chain. It's a chain. People act as if it's three silos, but it's a chain. So ask yourself a question. How does an economic entity know they are creating a disclosure correctly? How does the economic entity use machine-based processes to check if the report is created correctly? And how does a data aggregator wanting to use the reported information identify a specific disclosure in a report? Think about this stuff not in human-readable terms, but in machine-readable terms. Okay? So first, I want to explain the different tools you have for leveraging structures. You have networks and you have hypercubes. These are artifacts that are in XBRL that are useful for identifying structures. So the first question that you might have is, why do you have two technical artifacts instead of one? We have networks and we have hypercubes. Why is that? Okay, well, the answer, if you understand the history of XBRL, XBRL 2.1 did not include XBRL Dimensions. And then XBRL Dimensions was created a couple of years later, and they had a mandate not to break XBRL 2.1, so they basically had to retrofit hypercubes within networks and make all this stuff work correctly. And this is why this use of networks and hypercubes can be a bit perplexing, and why you have to be careful, because if you don't get this right, people are not going to be able to use the reports or the reporting scheme effectively. And that's what's happening with IFRS and US GAAP. It's just not working the way that it needs to work, and the way that it's done now will never work. So why do you have structures? There's two reasons. Number one, personal preference. You want to do something, you want to organize something a specific way or a particular way, or the technical reality is you have to use them because you'd have a technical conflict if you did not use them. And this is why structures exist, to make it so you can technically achieve the things that you want to achieve, that you need to achieve. So you do not get to change the rules of mathematics, the rules of logic, the rules of common sense, if there are rules, accounting rules, reporting rules, or the technical specification of how XBRL works. You can't change that. Those are a given. XBRL is called a specification because it specifies how things are to be done at the syntax level. Okay, so you don't have any power over these things. You do have power over what you want to do and what you have to do. Okay, so consider the following structures of information, A and B. So which is preferable? So they both work. B is a little bit more readable because you have some abstract concepts that help you understand where one thing starts and another thing, and it's where one thing starts and stops. Okay, and so here, these are both in the same network. They're both in the same hypercube. You could take these and further break them down and put each of these in a separate network or within a separate hypercube, and you can break these down even more and see them even more specifically. Okay, so when people put too many things together, it becomes a problem with using the information that they've represented. So what do I mean by you have to represent things in a certain way? So this is what I mean. Here you have three structures. These three structures are three different ways of breaking down the same total. So this concept, trade and other receivables net, is the same in all three of these structures. So within XBRL, say calculation relations, it's impossible to represent this structure and this structure and this structure in the same network. If you tried to do that, it just wouldn't work because you'd have everything running together into this one total. So in order to get around that, you put these representations in different networks, and that allows for you to represent what you want to represent, and it will technically work the way that you want it to work. This is what I mean by you have to do certain things within networks and hypercubes. So a couple things about structures. There are two fundamental ways that you can identify a structure using a machine-based process. Number one, you can use a unique identifier. The structure, if it has a name, you can grab that name and then use it reliably. The second is prototype theory. What prototype theory says is that if you know, if you have a specification for something, then you can use that specification to go and find it, even though it doesn't have a name. Okay. Now you have to give the specification a name, but if you have a specific disclosure and you can, the characteristics of the disclosure are described somewhere, then you can effectively identify a structure and then know what that structure is that you're working with. So consider the following. So here you have A and B. You have two identical fragments of information. The only difference is that one has a unique hypercube. The other has no hypercube. So both of these could be identifiable, but you can't do it in the same way because this one has a name and this one doesn't have a name. How could you identify this by name? You could use the network. Okay, but here you can see that these have the same network name, but they have different hypercube names. So here is another way of mentioning or describing hypercubes. This doesn't make sense because you only see one hypercube here, but if you look at all three hypercubes in this SFAC6 example, the balance sheet has the same hypercube name, the comprehensive income has the same hypercube name, and the changes in equity have the same hypercube name. So you can't use the hypercube name to identify the structure. You have to use the network name. So there's a spectrum here. So I'm going to just go over the different approaches that you can use. And again, the goal, how did I achieve this? I was able to identify the balance sheet changes in equity, and comprehensive income in all of these examples that I'm showing you, except one, which is the last, the pathological example. So I'll get to that. So here's what I mean by prototype theory. Here you see, so this is a summary of this. I just expanded these buttons here. These are the rules for discovery of this disclosure. So looking at comprehensive income, the rules are you have a name, comprehensive income, that's the disclosure name. It must be represented as a roll-up, and that roll-up needs to have a total comprehensive income. And that is enough to uniquely identify this piece. And this has a rule that is pretty basic, and this has a rule, and all three pieces can be identified using a specification of the components that make up the structure. So now let me get into this. These are the summary of the things I want to go over. Using Hypercubes as identifier, networks, and a specification, and then combining the two. So anyway, let's get right into it. So here, I'm using Hypercubes as a unique identifier. What I'm noticing is that, so here, balance sheet Hypercube, comprehensive income, changes in equity. Because it's unique, I can reliably identify this structure, and this structure. In addition, I have a specification for what this structure, how it's created. This is the specification. This is the prototype. So there is a total. This has a roll-up pattern. So the specification of this structure exists within the structure itself. It is an undisputed example of what this disclosure looks like. Same here and same here. So basically, this has a built-in specification just by providing a unique name here. So I'm not sure if this makes sense, but it'll maybe become more clear as we move on. So, but let's say that you use the other strategy. Now here I gave each of these a unique or the same name, Hypercube, and it's kind of a funky name, but the point is there's one name. So what I'm noticing is that you can still uniquely identify these by the network. Okay, as long as everyone creating a report uses the base taxonomy's network identifiers, you can reliably identify this structure. And then this actually has exactly the same characteristics as the first, where the Hypercube is used as a unique identifier. You can reliably know what you're working with because you have a unique identifier on each structure. So another approach is where you don't use Hypercubes at all. Okay, so there is no Hypercube in any of these. So this will not work in many cases because if you must use dimensions to represent something in the report, then you're going to violate a best practice, which is mixing dimensional models and non-dimensional models, which you do not want to do. So here, this is kind of limiting, but you can still identify these structures by the network, even though there is no Hypercube at all. But again, you have to use the base taxonomy. You can't have each filing entity create their own network, which is what SEC filers are required to do. Each company creates its own network identifiers. So you can identify something within an entity's report, but you cannot use that identifier across entities because each entity has a different identifier because they create their own identifiers. So this is problematic. It starts to get problematic, but it still works. This still works if you don't have to use hypercubes. Okay. If you did have to use a hypercube, then sometimes you have a network as an identifier, and sometimes you have a network plus a hypercube as an identifier. Okay, a third way to explain structures is to have a specification of that structure, a prototype of that structure. So again, here I have 3 different disclosures, and I've described each one of those using rules, and I can use these rules to discover these structures and reliably know what piece of the report that I'm looking for. So for example, I do have to create a name. This is the disclosure comprehensive income, and I say that it's a roll-up, and I say that it has a concept of comprehensive income as the total, and that's enough information for this small taxonomy or reporting scheme, the SFAC elements of a financial statement, for me to distinguish between these 3 structures. The fourth approach is to combine approach number 1 and approach number 3. Okay, so here I have unique hypercubes, plus I have a specification. So what I'm realizing is this is redundant. It's overkill. I could discover each one of these disclosures simply by giving it a hypercube name, or I could discover it using this other information. I've done both, which I can doubly discover it, but that makes no sense. It's just I'm doing a lot of extra work that is unnecessary by creating both a unique hypercube and a specification for the disclosure. So number 5 is the same thing, except I can't. So here you see the hypercubes, but if I use the networks as the identifier, then I can't use the hypercube to look up what disclosure I'm working with, because it doesn't exist. And this would happen if you use the same hypercube name on every disclosure, or if you didn't use hypercubes at all. So this will work, and it's not necessarily redundant, but it will work. I think it may be redundant. So for contrast, here is a pathological example. So this is a little bit hard to convey with this just one slide, but I'm gonna give it a shot. I may have to go do this a couple times. This is really pretty deep information, but hopefully people can get this. So what if you had no unique network identifier? So for example, for US GAAP reports submitted to the SEC, every company creates their own identifier, so therefore there are no unique identifiers. Okay? What if you also had no unique hypercube? You either don't have a hypercube, or like the US GAAP taxonomy, you could use statement table, like Microsoft used that for 100 different disclosures, statement tables. That's like using the hypercube. So you don't have a unique hypercube. You don't have a prototype disclosure. There's nothing that explains exactly what the disclosure is. So for example, the US GAAP taxonomy does not have the notion of a disclosure. What it is, it's just a pick list of stuff. You cannot send a piece of software against that taxonomy and say, give me all the disclosures. You have no rules for that is described in the disclosures. You have no rules that say that this is required to be a roll-up. This is required to be the total of that roll-up, or provide alternatives that could be used as total for the roll-up. And what if you had no disclosure names? What if you had no names for this disclosure comprehensive income statement? So what I'm describing is both the US GAAP taxonomy and the IFRS taxonomy. They're both for SEC filings, they both work the same way. None of these are unique. You can't use any of this to discover anything. So how do you find, for example, the balance sheet of every company reliably within a report? How do you, if you're trying to create a system that makes sure that you're creating reports correctly, how do you do that if you have none of these rules? If you want to extract information for a specific disclosure, how do you do that? You can't in the way that the SEC, the IFRS taxonomy, and the US GAAP taxonomy are constructed. So I'm showing you this for an example that only has 3 structures, but it works for 30 structures or 60 structures or however many structures that you want to have in your report. You can have a rule that uniquely identifies each one, which I do here. You can find it. You can make sure that the representation is consistent with that, either the rules or the prototype, or in my case, I'm doing both, which I believe is redundant and overkill. Anyway, I'm going to stop for now.